Okay, well, welcome to Global Christian Perspectives, and this week we've got a number of interesting stories we'll be looking at, and debate on dealing with death and how that Christians should approach that topic in the age of modern medicine. But we're going to start off with a story dealing with the Pope. The Pope is coming to America, and this Pope is definitely bringing a lot of changes. And one of the things that some of the interesting story that caught my eye was he's coming to America. I know he wants to stress compassionate care for illegal aliens and others, and he's going to be giving, of 18 speeches, 14 will be in Spanish. And wondering if anyone has any reaction to that particular story. Chris, you want to jump in?
I think that makes sense to me because I think that the crowds will be predominantly Spanish speaking. And I say that based on the interest in the actual seeing and meeting of the Pope. I think more of that part of the church is more interested in that one-to-one type thing. So I think it's fine. Great. And it's his native language. Maybe he feels he knows the idioms of that language better than English.
That is one thing I read in the article, is that he's more comfortable in Spanish, given that he's from Argentina. I was wondering if that might be counterproductive to his overall message. How are the rest of, considering the issues with illegal immigration in this country, is that going to contribute or harm or?
I'm trying to figure out why this is even a question, actually, because Spanish is his vernacular language. That's what he speaks. That's what he's comfortable with. Why would this be a question, except, of course, only in America?
Yeah. Would we be surprised if most of the previous popes were from Italy, spoke most of their speeches in Italian? Probably not. Yeah.
I agree. English is probably not even his third language. Fourth, fifth, sixth, I'd estimate. Certainly, from my point of view, where I see a foreign head of state arriving in this country, I expect them to speak their native language rather than English, particularly if they have anything important to say. I know quite a few of the European leaders, when they come here, they will speak in their native language and use an interpreter, even though they are actually reasonably competent in English. And the base reason is it is just too easy to get things wrong if you're not in your first or sometimes second language if you're seriously bilingual. I'm sure the Pope could do a good job of a speech in Latin, for instance, but I'm not sure whether we'd think that was any more approachable.
Does anyone happen to know with Benedict, did he do a lot of his speeches in German, or did he tend to go to Latin?
I can't answer that.
My memory is that it was mostly Latin in his case.
I tried to ignore Benedict as much as possible, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, well, moving on from that...
I was just going to say, I think it's just more interesting that the Pope is visiting than what languages he gives his speeches in.
Amen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to continuing with the Pope, there's some increasing stories that, at least in the United States, and one of the things that may make the language issue a little bit more of an issue here is there's a growing dissatisfaction within at least part of the Catholic Church over this particular pope, which is probably to be expected. Anytime you go from a series of popes like the last two that have a particular direction, and you get a pope that changes direction, there's bound to be people who are happy with the change, and bound to be people who are unhappy with the change. Is this much to do about nothing? Is this one of the big things I keep hearing about this pope is that, on the one hand he's making lots of changes, but then on the other hand, no, he's really not making a lot of changes. It's just more a matter of tone. So how do you see this? Is this a changing pope, or is this basically more of the same with a different tone?
Well, I would say first of all, I think it's really just an in-house debate between between Catholicism, and I do think it's a change of tone in many ways. I have to tell many of my progressive Protestant friends who have no idea how Catholicism works that the Pope will not be changing the Catholic Church's positions on social issues. It's just not the way that works. But I do think he's attempting to bring a little bit of a different tone, and I know that probably unnerves some conservative Catholics, but I think this is more of an in-house discussion. The other thing I think maybe that's happening is the one thing he has done is he sort of seemed to clean out the Vatican in a way in reference to people who were benefiting economically from the wealth of the Vatican, and that he has come down hard on church leaders who have used their authority and their influence to sort of pad their own pockets. I think that's where he has come down, and I think that's probably where some of the unrest is.
Chris?
I agree. I can't point to anywhere where he's changed Catholic doctrine, but certainly his stress is very different, and more to the point, his way of doing business within the church is different. It's much more open, and he's far more in favour of less ceremony and more interaction. And as Alan mentions, he's got rid of a certain amount of the bureaucracy. It isn't surprising that the bureaucracy hates him, because he's reducing them. And that's nothing to do with doctrine. That is just the way he's reacting. Personally, I like the guy because although it's only a matter of stress, what he's saying sounds to me far more like Jesus than what I've seen from several previous popes. And that's what I really want to hear from the leader of the biggest Christian denomination.
Jody, any comments?
Well, my thoughts come from having joined the Catholic Church in the mid-50s as an infant, and then leaving it in the late 70s. But the Vatican has always been kind of a hive of gossiping, backbiting old ladies, ever since Peter and the boys left in the first century. So these, like you said, these bureaucratic positions are starting to disappear, and that upsets people. They're no longer sitting in their brocaded chairs and, all that. And like Chris said, this Pope seems to actually have read the Bible and sees things as, every church should go out and take in a refugee family and sponsor them and care for them and, etc. And, to me that's a coarse kind of idea as opposed to something new. But it's good to hear that fresh air that seems to be blowing through the Vatican right now.
Do you see this as, this is a question for all of you, I tend to look at this as very similar to a lot of denominations where you have a hierarchy. Is this something unique to the Catholic Church, or is this the Catholic Church is one of the biggest and oldest?
Well, institutions are inherently conservative, and what I mean by conservative here is that they tend to protect what is, and I think so. I think this is kind of what happens with institutions. By the way, and the word conservative there does not mean, not a reference to necessarily conservative theology or politics. I mean, I'm a mainline Protestant, and our hierarchy tends to be more left, and more the liberal side, and yet, boy, I'll tell you what, trying to enact any kind of change in United Methodism is next to impossible. So they tend to want to protect themselves, and I think that's what's going on here.
Well, and I think this Pope is trying to communicate more with the parish priests, you know, and exact the change at the parish level, and really, you know, realizes that how much he can actually change within the bureaucracy is probably going to be not a lot, but at the parish level, at the people level, you know, I think he feels that he does have some opportunity for some sway or some influence.
Good.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed the article you linked to talked about was whether he could manage with this much of the bureaucracy apparently against him, and it does occur to me that the Catholic Church is not a constitutional monarchy, far less a republic. It's fundamentally an autocratic institution, and if he really wants to do something, he probably can.
Although oftentimes in organizations like this, and I'm not that familiar with the Catholic Church in terms of a power structure, but oftentimes you can do pretty much anything you want, except that by doing it, you actually oftentimes undermine your own power, and to the point that you can't do anything. Right. So it's you know, sometimes you have the power to do things only because you actually don't do them.
Well, I think the Pope could change what he wants if he's willing to do what popes have had in their arsenal, if you will, and that is speak ex cathedra. But the reason that most popes have not spoken ex cathedra is because I think they're afraid they're going to be wrong, and so they don't want to speak in a way that is so infallible that everybody has to follow it. And I also don't think that just doesn't strike me in in Francis's personality to do something like that.
Yeah.
What he can do, however, is appoint people to particular locations and shift them around, right, more or less as he wishes, and he has been doing some of that to get stick-in-the-mud people out of key positions, which encourages me.
That's actually one of the reasons I've been a little reluctant to take a position on this Pope, simply because I tend to see this as the action of a Pope is more long-term in terms of effects, and we probably, I would say it's probably too early to know how effective this Pope will be, because it's like Chris says, a lot of their power is not so much what they do, but who they appoint and how they put people into positions, and the effects of that are oftentimes not immediate, but more down the road.
Yeah.
By the way, we do have the question and answer app up and running, so if anybody has any questions they'd like to submit, go ahead and send them in, and we will try to answer them. With that, let's move on to our next topic, which is an article I saw on science, and one of my concerns for a long time has been the politicization of science. And I saw recently an article where I think it was something like 1/3 of peer-reviewed articles could not be reproduced, that they had gone in, surveyed. We've seen scandals in the past where, you know, fraudulent data and stuff. This isn't quite to that level, but it is raising concern as to if you can't reproduce something, was the original investigation, how valid was it? And there was recently a bill that went into Congress to basically say before a regulatory agency can can mandate a new law regulation based on science that they have to have the science has to be reproducible, and that the data has to be available, has to be made available to other researchers to verify and look at. And what surprised me about that is that it went on a pretty much party line vote, and I was surprised that, to me, what seemed like a fairly common sense measure ended up being extremely political in terms of its outcome. Any reactions to that overall story? And
I did have a reaction to that. Certainly on closer examination of what was actually being proposed there, it falls into two parts. The second part you mentioned, the making your data available to other people, I think there's absolutely no contest about. The problem with requiring that everything be reproducible is really twofold. One of the elements of that is that there are some studies which are so vast that nobody is actually going to reproduce them. So requiring that they be reproducible is shooting in the foot anything that relies on such a vast database. The other is, of course, that some data sets, particularly in fields like meteorology, climate science, are not reproducible because that's what's happened. You can't reproduce the conditions that gave rise to that particular set of data. Yes, some fuss was made when a very large study didn't make available its data set to other researchers. I think that was wrong. But my worry with this particular piece of legislation is that the target is basically shooting down any attempt to do anything about global warming on the basis that climate science data can't be reproduced because it's historical.
any other comments?
Yeah, well, I think obviously when anytime you have government involved and you have politics involved, it's always going to make for an interesting exchange. And I think what a lot of this reveals is the philosophy of government, a philosophy of economics, and that, by the way, science also has philosophical underpinnings as well. And so, as far as the reproducibility or whether it's reproducible or not, I mean, I agree with Chris. I also don't want to be careful to say that valid science doesn't have to be either one, that it depends on what you're dealing with. It will depend on whether it's reproducible or not, and you have to then look at each issue as they come, and not make any kind of blanket rules on that, because I think that science doesn't always fit into one or the other.
Yeah, part of the problem does come down to the climate aspects. The EPA just issued, I think one of the spawnings for this was EPA issued a whole series of rules, but refused to release any of the data that went along with it. It was basically under the guise of, well, just trust us, we see there's a big problem, but we're not going to let you actually look at the studies or the data that show that there's a problem.
Well,
and
yeah.
Given...
I mean, I'm there. I'm sorry, you go ahead.
I was going to say, given the fact that, I mean, as we've discussed before, I know it's no shock to some of you that I'm a skeptic, and given the fact that the models so far have never been correct, they're making predictions that are consistently been wrong. I'm reluctant to want to make major changes based on science that is, to me, unsettled. But I still was, even with that, I was somewhat surprised that that it was such a partisan issue. I do agree with you, Chris, that some studies are not going to be reproducible, and I would think in a better world, even though we disagree on some issues, we could probably get together and both of us are technically background and come up with a definition of what reproducible is that would suit both of our requirements.
Yeah.
But that's,
well, let me also say that just in my own personal experience, as someone who has worked with some local government officials in reference to doing certain things in reference to drainage and sewage that actually is more environmentally friendly and better, that the EPA in the last few years has really ruled with an iron fist. And that even the sympathizers who say we want to do this, we want to bring this into compliance, we want to do that, that when the local authorities want more time on certain things or want to explain why they need to do this or do something else a little bit differently, the EPA has been extremely insensitive and basically has not been willing to budge, and which has frustrated even the more progressive local officials who agree with them. They really have had an iron fist kind of way of ruling in the last few years.
well, I think that goes back to part of the problem. I mean, one of the criticisms, for example, with the IPCC reports isn't so much with the science that underlies it. I remember a few years back reading an analysis of it where they had looked at the early drafts, which were primarily written by the more scientifically minded people, versus the final draft, which was strongly influenced by the more political people, and pointing out the differences between them and where they had made key changes to heighten the climate science itself. So I do think this is an ongoing problem, and I see this, by the way, not only in climate science. It happens in a whole. I mean, we see it on a daily basis. How many times has coffee gone from good to bad to bad to good to good to bad again, because of all the various studies coming out, and sometimes making some of these decisions gets very difficult. Any final comments before we move on to our final story?
No, just it'd be great if we can get politicians out of science, but that's never going to happen.
Yeah. Well, if we just get them out of politics, that would help too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, our final story today, and one we're going to be taking into the second half of the show, deals with the whole issue of Christian approach to death and dying. California just passed a law on assisted suicide. There are now 4 other states, I believe, that have that, and it's also Chris was mentioning that's a growing issue in Europe. And is it a law that's being passed in England, or is it just Europe in general, Chris?
We had a bill in the House of Commons just over a week ago to allow assisted suicide under some very heavily regulated conditions, which failed fairly overwhelmingly. The background to this is that we have 2 or 3 people a week at the moment making a trip to Switzerland so they can use the Dignitas clinic there for exactly that purpose. So.
Well, why don't we start off? We'll get more into the details and underlying issues in the next half hour. But Jody, I know this is a field where you've worked in hospice. How do you approach this whole topic?
Well, I think the key component that gets everybody, because it pulls at your heartstrings or whatever, is dealing with the issue of terminally or chronically ill people who do not have good pain control. They do not have what is perceived as having a quality of life. And to me, that really is not a valid reason. And I think that is where we need to put our efforts instead of putting our efforts into suicide. We need to put our efforts into education. We need to put our efforts into things like hospice, where we have so many different medications, we have so many different ways of delivering those medications. By delivering, I mean like intravenously, in patches, pills, whatever. And the quality of life and the whole perspective of that can be achieved now, and some of the old methods need to be just completely washed out, so that this really is not an issue. And I think in that will help people deal with suicide or not suicide.
Well, I know, there's the old saying that hard cases make bad law. And I think part of this is one of the issues here. But there are people, for example, who argue, based on libertarian grounds, that we have the right to do with our bodies whatever we want, including suicide, and that suicide should be made legal, and just if you, without any conditions, if you feel like committing suicide, you should have the right to go down and commit suicide at a medically approved clinic or something like that. Would everyone agree that that's probably not a good idea?
Well, it's I would say that well, two things real quickly on that. First of all, anyone who's read any of my work knows that I am not much in love with the notion of rights. I think it's a very problematic category. I find the idea of right to die rather strange. That I have a right to something that's going to happen to me whether I want it to or not. It's just really a strange kind of idea to me. I mean, if I give up my right to die, can I live forever? I mean, I do not quite understand that kind of language. The second thing is, addressing the libertarian comment that you made, and I only say this to Christians, is that if we are, for Christians, we have to embrace the idea that our lives do not belong to us, that our bodies do not belong to us. Paul says our bodies are temples to the Spirit. Therefore, we cannot do with our bodies whatever we would like. So if you're going to make an argument from a Christian perspective for assisted suicide, and I don't think that can be done, but if you're going to make that argument, you cannot use the argument that we have a right to do with what we want with our own lives, because we belong to God, we belong to the Lord.
Yeah, it sounds like we're all pretty much in agreement here that a general right.
I do actually tend more to the libertarian point of view, I have to say, which may come as a major surprise to you. I accept what Alan says, and that is certainly a problem for me in terms of my church, which does most definitely consider that suicide is a sin, on much the grounds that Alan suggested. However, I've looked through Scripture rather extensively, and yes, I appreciate what Paul says, but I also see that arguably you could see Samson as an example of an approved suicide, in fact an approved homicide as well at that point. And on one view, taken from John's Gospel, you could see Jesus' sacrifice as a form of suicide by cop. I have, however, an interest here, because I may be the only one of the four of us who's actually tried to commit suicide in the past. It wasn't as a result of relieving physical pain. It was as a result of not being able to stand any more of it about halfway through a 17-year major depression. And I was unable to take pleasure in anything. I couldn't remember what being happy was like, and I couldn't see any possible way out of it. In addition, there were some rather striking reasons why me not being around might be an advantage to some people. It was going to be a negative to them as well, however. So, at that point, I was taking the view that, yes, I'm given life by God, and please can you have it back? I can't cope with it anymore. And I indeed prayed before taking an overdose, which in fact didn't work. I have a huge amount of sympathy for anybody who is in a similar situation now. And the last thing I would want to do is heap a set of religious guilt on top of the guilt they are no doubt already going to feel as a result of the decision. Now, as matters stand at the moment, I don't think on any way of looking at it, it is right to say that we entirely belong to ourselves. Even if you don't take the passage that Alan was talking about, we are not born into this world wholly independent and able to fend for ourselves. We are born into families, we are born into communities, we are born into connection with other people. And anything we do to end our own lives is inevitably going to impact on a lot of other people. We always ought to be thinking in those terms, but I can tell you from experience that someone who is really seriously depressed is not going to be able to think that way. That's me.
But is there a place for the community? Is there a place for the rest of us to instead of providing the assisted suicide, is there not a place for the rest of us to learn and grow and reach out? Like when you were at that place, and just not take no for an answer, so to speak. You know, that as depressed as you were at that time, as unable to just know that at the bottom of this pit where you were, there were still hands that were reaching out and would continue to reach out and say to you, your life matters to me. You know, I love you. Your life matters to me. And take that approach instead of what, in my mind, is more of a, I don't want to say easy way out, but more of a, it will affect me less if I, allow this law to pass, and that it takes more from me to continue to reach out to you, to continue to love you. But in fact, that's what I should be doing. I should be loving you, not saying, "Oh well, there is Chris,"
Yeah.
And I may get rejected every day, but I still feel that I'm supposed to still reach my hand out one more time, one more time, one more time.
Yeah, I would just say that one of the benefits, well, if there is a thing that God can use in this, it's that people who have encountered this kind of thing, as you talk about, Chris, and I've never been there, so I cannot emphasize or empathize with that. But we need people who have been there to minister to people who now are there. I agree, Jody. The thing I was thinking just before you were talking was the same thing. Is that as a church, where is the place of the church in reference to radical hospitality to offer to those who are in such pain and misery? And is it now becoming too easy for us not to have to do that? That I can continue on with my life, not have to worry too much about those who are really hurt. The Pope says every church takes in a family, right? Or every house takes in a family, you know. And we love that kind of stuff. We say that's wonderful, but is this another way with assisted suicide that we're allowing ourselves an opt-out of that kind of sacrificial hospitality?
Yeah.
Well, let me bring this back because I know it's been mentioned a couple of times that the concept of sin, and even before I was a Christian, I was a little uncomfortable with the concept of suicide as a sin. Although it's like the punishment's already been there. I mean, on the other hand, I think there's value in it, to be a little bit contrarian here, in the sense that we do not want to heap guilt on people, particularly people who are suffering. But on the other hand, someone who commits suicide, I know that we had a case in the United States where a military person committed suicide, and the general gave some in charge gave some very stark comments about that, focusing mainly on what happened to those who were left behind and how devastating it was for someone who, because what's the common thing when someone commits suicide? No one saw it coming. You can debate whether that's true or not, but that's something you hear frequently, is no one realized it. And do we really want to basically say, well, it's okay, we understand, and make it easier for them to commit suicide, even if we don't go to the point of legalizing it? Or does by basically saying it's a sin, and it's a sin because of the damage it does, not so much to taking your own life, but the damage it does to everybody around you, is what the real harm in it is? Comments on that?
The equation I made at the time was, rightly or wrongly, that I was causing more harm by being there, being a drain on people, being a nuisance to them, being very irascible if anybody did reach out a hand of friendship to me, because I just couldn't stand that kind of human contact. Both sides were wrong, and from where I stand now, I think I chose the wrong way. But I had another 7 years after that of basically making up my mind one day at a time that today was not the day I was going to leave it. And that came on the basis of a very small word from God the morning after I woke up from the overdose. Basically said, go and do this. That was the last thing I heard for 7 years, which you may think is undue perseverance, but that kept me going at that point. I will stress that the legislation that they were contemplating in our Parliament would not have catered for anybody who was depressed. It would only have catered for terminal illness and cases where people were in severe pain and so disabled by it that they couldn't do the job themselves. And that is really the problem that is there. Most people can probably manage to get their hands on some way of doing it if they're reasonably able-bodied, for instance. I leave it there. I mean, where somebody is in that kind of physical shape, and I am thinking here of a friend of mine who has in contemplation that he may be in the near future as a result of a degenerative illness. they're going to be faced with the feeling that they are no use to anybody. They can't pursue any of the things that used to give them joy, and they are merely waiting for the end. And hastening that end, I really cannot criticise them for wanting to do. From my point of view, one way or the other, they will be with God and giving an account of themselves shortly afterwards. So.
Yeah, I don't think we want to make light at all about the kinds of situations that people get in where they contemplate this. I mean, I think that indeed, in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of difficulties, I mean, I think it's understandable why some people would say, look, I just would like to go out before it gets any worse. Just as a more think about this theologically, just for a quick minute, you know, I know we would all agree here that in order for us as Christians to live the Christian life well, we need people around us who can help teach us to live that life well. We call them the saints, people who, you know, we cannot live this Christian life in isolation. So when we need those saints around us, and we can all name saints who have helped us be more faithful. If we need people to help us live well as Christians, we need people to help us die well. And the reality is, some of us are going to die more slowly. And we need people who are willing to hang on to show us how to die well. And if someday that is the way I die, I want to be able to, at that time, draw on the saints who, as a pastor over the years, has watched some saints with terminal illnesses, difficult illnesses, but who have died well. They have died faithfully. They have become an example to me. If at some point, that is my fate. And I just don't think that we can be without those persons.
One of my big concerns in a lot of this is when you're dealing with hard cases, it's very easy to focus on the particular case, but the patterns get set for the society in general, and it's no longer, you know, you can't really pass a law that says if you have a hard case, then you can do this. They try to define it a bit, but at some point, you know, I get concerned with the more societal aspects of it, where the right to die. I know Alan doesn't particularly like the term, but that's, and I actually kind of agree with him on that. But the so-called right to die somehow gets transformed into the duty to die. In terms of pressures on society, I remember a case where I support the concept of letting, you know, removing life support, but I remember a case, I think it was in Florida, where an elderly gentleman married a younger woman, and it was written into the prenuptial agreement that if the marriage lasted however many years, 2 years I think it was, then she would get his multi-million-dollar inheritance. If she died, if the marriage, presuming divorce, then it would go to the son. Well, 6 months into the marriage, he ended up with a stroke, and some of the question was, do we pull the plug? That's probably a little bit of an extreme example, but situations like that are going to arise, and there, you know, people will then suddenly be being pushed into making decisions that they wouldn't normally make for other reasons that are beyond the scope of the law now, and I'm just that is something that concerns me.
Mm-hmm.
It is not an accident, Elgin, that in that article you linked us to, look at the groups that have opposed this legislation. Groups who support people with disabilities, homeless children, sick children, all the groups that deal with people on the margins and people who are really vulnerable are opposed to this. And I think that's exactly the reason why they're opposed to this, because the right to die will turn into a duty to die.
Well, and I think
if you're not pulling your weight, why are you get off the wagon? Go ahead, Jody.
Yeah, and I think that this is a subject we tend not to want to deal with. We're okay with talking about the end times in a general theoretical, when Jesus comes back and everything's going to be glorious kind of way, but to talk about the end times of our individual lives and what is our goal, and what is our goal as the ones that are standing by to, as Alan said, to support us or whatever. Those are the kind of Bible studies we don't really want to talk about. The only time, if obviously most of you guys wouldn't know this, but the only time that hospice really gets like people coming to educational kind of things is when we do grief during the holidays. And it's like all of a sudden people realize that the emotion and all the family issues of, say, Thanksgiving, Christmas, that sort of thing, that they have issues, and so then they'll show up for a 2-hour session or a 4-hour session and get the quick fix and get through that holiday and move on. But we don't want to talk about a broader issue, not only of what about when I die, but what about when you die, and how can I help you, and that sort of thing. So again, I'm saying that we as a church we've got to get on board with the sacrifice and die a little more to this all about me thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty clear that I agree that there's definitely a need for ministry in this area. Mm-hmm. In terms of reaching out to people that are hurting, and people that are hurting to the point that they're considering taking their own life. That is clearly an area where the church needs to make sure that they are not only present but very visible, because I suspect, Chris, that there probably were people reaching out, but when you're in that state, isn't it a little hard to see them?
Yeah, you can't see them on the whole. You can maybe see them a bit more if they have been in that situation themselves, and they can share from a position of actually knowing what it's like. But those networks are very weak as matters stand. I do a bit of work myself these days in that direction, not as much perhaps as I should do. But yeah, it's vital for there to be some kind of lifeline. The other thing that struck me was, from what Jody was saying at the early stage, quality of life is extremely important, and if we can make the quality of life reasonably bearable for people who are in extreme situations, then the problem really goes away. The snag I see is that end-of-life care can be very, very expensive. At the moment, our NHS will pay for it. On your side, I am not sure how that gets fixed. But I can see the NHS not wanting to in the future, and that's going to leave us with some very nasty decisions.
Can I ask a question of you, Chris?
Yeah.
You were talking about people are going to Switzerland or Sweden or
Switzerland, yes.
Switzerland. So say I, as an American citizen, I can just fly over to Switzerland and check myself into this place?
I believe so, yes.
As long as I have the money, I can.
Indeed so.
Okay.
They're not gonna let you kill yourself for free.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I find that I don't want to say the word amazing. It's hard for me to wrap my brain around it.
Astounding.
Yeah.
In fact,
actually, I think you can go to Oregon. I don't think you have to go to Switzerland. Just go up to Oregon. There's 4 states in the union that allow this now. I'm not sure what the exact controls are in each state, but
I think that there's just a whole lot of very disconcerting presumptions about a lot of issues that are floating around here for me. Yes, we can talk about the very difficult cases, and we need to take those difficult cases into account. Difficult cases do not make good law. I agree with you on that. We need to take into account all of the complexity of some of this stuff that happens, and not every case is going to neatly fit into our philosophical system. Having said that, I'm extremely concerned that what I see happening is we're going down a road that we can only go down when you have embraced rampant individualism, when you have embraced autonomy, when you have embraced community as only what it can do for me, not as what I need to do for the community. And when you have embraced this kind of what I would call idolatrous language that says, I belong to me, and therefore it's only about me, and therefore my decisions. And that also, so I just have a great concern that those assumptions, presumptions, are leading us down some roads that when we get to the end, I think we're going to wish we had turned back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I'd say that's a splendid attitude, but it does mean that it is incumbent upon us to make sure there is nobody who feels excluded from our community. Nobody in any situation whatsoever.
Right. Right. I mean, I agree. I'm there.
Yeah, I reach out to you whether you are an illegal immigrant or whether you're gay or whatever. As a Christian, it's not my job to qualify who gets my outreach.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't get to pick and choose to whom we minister to.
Amen.
Well, I only minister to sinners, so.
And we only minister.
Boy, that's a lot.
Like you, Elgin.
Absolutely.
Yeah, once you pick that category, there's not much else to filter on.
That's right. That's right.
Plenty of scope. Yeah.
So, one of the things, close off this discussion here towards the end, but one of the things that as I've grown in my Christian life, there was all these verses I read as a kid. Not really as a kid, because I became a Christian as in my early 20s. But one of these verses, you kept across. Well, now I look back that way. But there were these verses I kept reading, and they didn't make any sense to me because they were quite obvious. And as I get older, I'm finding that a lot of these verses are becoming very meaningful in terms of our current cultural discussions, just like God put them in there for, you don't need this now, but this verse will become important later on. And one of those verses was, the Old Testament, I put before you life and death. Choose life. And that was, when I first came across that verse, it was like, really? That's a choice I have to make? But it's a choice we are now having to make. And like so many choices that God presents us with, they're not always easy choices, even when they seem easy. I remember when I was in the Air Force, they had a rule saying you couldn't work more than 16 hours. And I thought, wow, that's great, right? Found out that it was actually one of the rules I hated the most, because if I was out I worked in missile sites, if I was out of a missile site and I couldn't get back to base, unpack my truck, and close everything out, within 16 hours, I had to stay out there. So I didn't like that rule. So a lot of the rules that sound initially okay are rules as we start actually working through the details as Christians, they become difficult. And sometimes it is easier just to say, well, let's just pass assisted suicide. Then the burden is no longer on me. It's now on them. They can kill themselves. I don't need to support them. I don't need to pay money to keep things going. I don't need to have all of this cost and a burden on me. That's on them now. And I think choosing life is sometimes a more difficult choice, but it's where we are. So, any comments on the concept of choosing life over death?
It's usually a better option. Death is, after all, a permanent solution to what might be a temporary problem.
Usually I think part of the problem is that since we human beings tend to gravitate toward the path of least resistance. Often the path of least resistance is the path that allows us to not have to sacrifice as much as we should. And often choosing life, and that includes, among other subjects and themes I've heard here today, choosing hospitality, choosing sacrifice, choosing to be a real presence in people's lives. That takes time, and that takes work, and it can take money. And so it becomes often just too easy to take the easier road and frankly, abandon people.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I've made myself a note here that I'm going to be thinking about these things over the next few days. I minister only to sinners and choose life, and I think that as I live my life as a Christian, choosing life makes it possible for life to flow into me, and then it also allows me to let life flow out of me. So. Yeah, you guys have given me something to think about this week, so thank you. I've had fun this time.
Well, I'm glad. Chris, any final comments?
I think we've said what we need to at this point.
Okay, well, we got kind of carried away, and we swept through the bottom of the hour break. So we didn't get a chance to reintroduce ourselves. So why don't we take a moment to basically explain to the audience who we are, and if you have any books or blogs or anything you want to have a shameless plug for, this is a great time to do it. Again, my name's Elgin Hushbeck, and I blog at hushbeck.com, and I have 4 books. One is Evidence for the Bible, Christianity and Secularism, Preserving Democracy, and What is Wrong with Social Justice. And Chris, why don't you...
I'm Chris Eyre. I'm one of the editors at Energion, and I blog at airlines.energion.net.
Okay. Alan?
Alan Bevere. I blog at alanbevere.com. That's 2 L's and 2 A's, ALLAN, Bevere.com. Have several books published. I'm co-editor of the Areopagus series for Energion. I'm just about finished with the book that I'm going to send off to Energion. And I'm a professor, and I pastor a downtown church, by the way, and minister to sinners who are in all kinds of interesting situations and behaviors in a downtown setting. And I want to tell you that sinners are much more interesting than saints a lot of the time.
I don't know too many of the latter, but they don't want me around for some reason. I don't fit in.
Come back, Elgin. We'll minister.
Jody, you want to?
I'm Jody Neufeld, and along with my husband Henry, we are blessed to be a part of this band called Energion Publications. And I do have a book that I will shamelessly plug, and it's called Grief: Finding the Candle of Light. And I just really appreciate this group of people and all of our authors. We are blessed.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. This has been Global Christian Perspectives. Be sure to check out the Energion channel on Tuesdays, where Henry will be interviewing another author. And we also have the Energion Discussion Network at energion.co/discuss, where every weekday one of the Energion authors puts up an article, and there's a lot of discussion and debate. Is one of the things you've probably known from watching this is we don't all agree, but we do get along, and we have some pretty good and wonderful discussions. So again, I want to thank you for joining us, and hope to have you join us again next week. Again, this is Global Christian Perspectives, and thank you for joining us.